Hi, my name is Charles Cecil and I am the founder and CEO of Revolution Software. I've had the privilege of working in video games and writing adventures for 40 years. My first game was for a computer called the St. Clair ZX81, which launched in 1981. It had 1K of memory, which seems extraordinary now. My iPhone has 256 million times as much. But at the time it was extraordinary because it had the power and the memory of the computers that landed Apollo 11 on the moon. And since nothing had come before, this power was just incredible and it was very, very exciting. My first game was unimaginatively called Adventure B. We had already had an Adventure A. My next was Adventure C. You see where it's going. And the packaging was very, very simple. It got a little bit more sophisticated later. And as you can see from this screenshot, it starts, I am in a jungle clearing, and that's it. That's the extent of the description. Many years later, I met somebody who played the game and he redescribed what he remembered. And he talked about parrots squawking and shadows through dappled leaves, none of which I'd actually written. And it was sort of incredible. I don't think I actually ever admitted to him that his memories were so much more extensive than what I'd actually written. But it did make it clear that when people played these games, they brought a lot of their own imagination to the game. The adventure genre was hugely successful throughout the 80s and the 90s. But by the end of the decade, the publishers had decided that adventures were, well, just too old-fashioned for the new generation of PlayStation and other console players who they believed, wanted to play visceral 3D games. So effectively, the genre was dead. But then with the seismic shift that changed from boxed to digital products in the early noughties, the decisions on which games could be made changed from the hands of the publishers to gamers who enthusiastically supported the adventure genre and continue to love adventures to this day. So to all of you, I thank you. I want to talk about my approach to writing adventure games and use Beyond a Steel Sky by way of examples, which I'm going to come to later. So our Revolution adventures use a multilinear narrative structure. Our objective is to write games that give as much agency as possible to the player while still keeping firm control on the narrative. And we do this by writing story elements that have minor plot beats, which are bits of information that are important but not central, which can be played in any order. However, the major narrative plot nodes, which are big advances, can only happen once all the required plot beats have been experienced. In film, there is a requirement to build an empathetic relationship between the audience and the protagonist, our hero. And empathy is sharing an emotional journey. It doesn't mean you necessarily like the hero, but you share their emotional journey. And a major part of the empathy comes from what is called the inciting incident, which is an event that profoundly upsets the balance within the protagonist's world, and it sets them on their narrative journey. Film has the luxury of time. The inciting incident can happen at up to 1/3 of the way through the film itself. It also sets up the obligatory scene, and this is the scene at the end in which balance is restored to the protagonist's world, the scene without which there is no story. Games, of course, are interactive. We set puzzles and we make our audience work from the start. But this gives us very little time to create context and motivation and to build empathy. So to do all of these things, we normally have a cutscene, which includes the inciting incident. There are many, many opportunities within interactive entertainment to create really compelling stories, but this requirement to build empathy so quickly is definitely a constraint. So you can see Act 1 is quite small. It creates the first act climax and sets up Act 2, which is the real meat of the story. You'll see that in Act 2 we offer meaningful player choices which pay off later in the game, in this case in Act 3, and I'll talk about this later. This additional agency, with the agency in how the multi-linear story unfolds, can and should deliver a really satisfying gameplay experience. One of our key goals is to interweave the narrative and the gameplay such that the story is driven forward by the puzzles, And the puzzles are designed to reflect the story at that point, the logic of the world and the motivation of the characters that inhabit it. If this is done well, we hope that the puzzles won't feel like blockers, but they'll feel like interesting narrative challenges. The idea of the expectation gap is taken from film theory. In it, the protagonist has a goal and an obvious or expected path, which they start before something blocks them, forcing them to take a path that involves risk. This path is then blocked, requiring them to take a new path with an even greater risk until finally they succeed. In taking this risk, with the associated jeopardy and the requirement to persevere, the satisfaction in the audience's mind of the protagonist eventually succeeding is enhanced. In adventure games, we can draw a parallel in that the initial level objective is blocked and the player is forced to pursue intermediate objectives, ideally each of which has greater interest and an escalating sense of threat. And as with film, this work enhances the satisfaction both in terms of the narrative and the gameplay when the player finally succeeds. Additional objectives are that the interface is easily accessible, usually without the requirement for manual dexterity. So the challenge comes from solving the puzzle and not mastering the UI, which means that puzzles are primarily cerebral, and as such they actually can appeal to both core gamers and a much broader audience. Also, the structure is a detective structure. Often our games start with a crime, and the player must gather clues, both physical and narrative, and work out what to do to progress in the story and to solve the crime. This will of course involve exploring the environment, discovering objects, talking to people. For Beyond a Steel Sky, I wanted to go further with this approach and create an additional gameplay feature which gives greater agency of the environment to the player. But before looking forward, we look back. Beneath a Steel Sky, released in 1994, was Revolution's second adventure game. We wrote it in conjunction with Dave Gibbons, the comic book artist behind Watchmen. And Dave, his primary role was to draw the backgrounds, which we then painted and sprite animated. But Dave also worked with us on the story and character design. He was a very integral part of the game. And a puzzle that I'd like to talk you through, which I was very proud of, used a system that we christened Virtual Theatre. So in this puzzle, our hero, Foster, needs to get into the apartment of a Yorkshire factory owner, Gilbert Lamb. Lamb regularly goes down in the elevator to check on his beloved cat. Foster can hack into the central control systems, called Link, and remove Lamb's authority to travel in the elevator. When Lamb discovers this by swiping his card and finding that it doesn't come, he asks Foster if he can check on his cat instead, and he gives Foster his apartment, the keycard to his apartment. And what I liked about this was that we were able to combine a puzzle which involved hacking with the virtual theatre character, Lamb, and how he responded. And in doing so, the puzzle unfolded and the solution became clear, and the player could move forward both in terms of the narrative and the adventure. Fast forward 25 years. Beyond a Steel Sky is the follow-up to Beneath a Steel Sky. The game launched recently on Apple Arcade and PC and is coming to console later this year. We were delighted to work with Dave Gibbons again as art director. And our ambition was to create a style to resonate with Dave's comic book art. Comic books are actually perfectly complementary to adventure games, not just for the aesthetic, but because the adventure backgrounds have so much information that are important for the game. And so by simplifying it in this way, the player is able to see what's important, what the hotspots are, without having to interpret a snowstorm of pixels. It's also a great way to set up a story. As I mentioned, we need to create empathy, we need to play the inciting incident, and this needs to be done powerfully and it needs to be done fast. So we worked with Dave to write a motion comic which we played, which could convey all of this really fast at the beginning, and we were really thrilled with the result. So we developed a system called Toontoy, which is an advanced toon rendering technology that delivers this unique graphic style. And our vision was that any real-time frame in the game looks as good, we hope, as it would do if it was a comic book frame. Beyond a Steel Sky has 3 core gameplay components: hacking, virtual theatre, and classic adventure. I'd like to demonstrate these components in an early section of gameplay. I'm afraid it does have a puzzle spoiler, so apologies if you want to look away. So the setup is that I found a way to open a bridge, and that allows Foster into the gate area. I know that I need an industrial battery. I encounter 4YR. He's a grumpy old school refuse droid. He picks up metal bales and dumps them into a toxic river. And guess what? He has an industrial battery that I need. So, first of all, hacking. The game has interconnected AI systems which the player can hack. By hacking the system, I find a system that forcefully extracts air and that the conveyor gently transports bales. I see that when the bales reach a pressure pad, a huge metal magnet picks them up and transports them away. By hacking the system and swapping the forceful and the gentle nugget, it breaks the system and it hurls the bale down the conveyor. For virtual theatre, as I mentioned, motivated characters have specific objectives which can be subverted by player actions. The droid, whose job it is to maintain this area, is attracted to the faulty conveyor. He clambers onto the pressure pad. And now we have the classic adventure puzzle. The magnet picks him up, leaving him unable to stop Foster from getting the battery. So the gameplay feels familiar, but we believe is much more dynamic. I'd like to return to structure. I don't believe in multiple endings. It's hard enough to come up with one that really works well, that pays off the inciting incident with the very best obligatory scene that closes all the character arcs in the best way that we can possibly think of. However, we are keen to give the player as much narrative agency as possible through meaningful gameplay choices. In an adventure, whether it's a game or a film, the convention is that meaningful change happens to key characters rather than the antagonist. In Beyond a Steel Sky, we have a character who meets Foster and who plays a very major role at the end. Now, I want to avoid giving away any more spoilers, but the player has several key choices that profoundly affect the relationship with that character. In Act 3, these key choices play out in the actions of the character at a climactic point, resulting them in either helping or betraying Foster at that critical moment. So the ending with regard to the protagonist, Foster, remains the same, but the way it is delivered is nuanced in that key characters will behave in a very different way based on earlier player choices. 40 years ago, I wrote my first text adventure. The memory constraints of the hardware at the time limited this to just text. As computers got more powerful with more memory, so simple graphic adventures emerged. For many years, the adventure drove cutting-edge technology. With the advent of CD, hundreds of megabytes could be stored, allowing more ambitious graphics, full music score, and voices. The adventure as a genre flourished in the 80s and 90s as more and more people were drawn to play these games. Back then, many people loved contrived puzzles, the sillier the better. These days, as the audience has broadened, people seem to prefer logical puzzles that drive strong narrative and make just a bit more sense. I would like to think that one of the reasons that our adventures have stayed popular over so many years is that I always aimed to design puzzles that were logical within the context of the world and the characters and to structure them, as I've demonstrated. Beyond a Steel Sky feels like the coming together of my experience of writing adventures over 40 years. If you've played the game or you play it in future, I hope that you'll feel that our approach is new and innovative. Thank you for watching.